Oh, hello. So this time I want to introduce this book, The Correspondence of Sir Ernest Satow, British Minister in Japan, 1895 to 1900, Volume 1. And as you can see, it's quite a thick one. It's letters to Satow, mainly from the Foreign Office and from consulates. And it's part of a 4-volume series. This one is paperback, but I've also, this one is Amazon, on Amazon. There is an earlier one on lulu.com, I think, still. And then I also created a hardcover version. This is volume 1A. The reason for that being that Amazon don't allow, or at the time when I created this hardcover, they did not allow hardcovers of more than 550 pages. And this one is slightly over that. So I had to make 1A and 1B of the hardcover. Anyway, it's still the same material. So what I'm going to do is read from the hardcover, which contains preface, some images, and a foreword by Dr. Jim Hoare. The Satow Papers references for 1A, this hardcover here, is our PRO 3033, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, and 56. So the second part of volume 1, in fact, 1B in the hardcover edition. Sorry, it's all a bit complicated, but it couldn't be helped. The references for this second part of the hardcover would be PRO 3033, 56, 57, 58, 59, and 510. So in the paperback, which is all of volume 1, you've got PRO 3033, 51 to 510 inclusive. And as far as what it actually contains, 51 is Foreign Office official, so is 52. 53 is Office of Works letters, all addressed to Satow, basically. So this would be Office of Works in Shanghai, responsible for the buildings, consular buildings and legation. 54, legation staff, John H. Gubbins, Japanese secretary and responsible for reporting on Japanese press and so on. 55, various legation staff. 56, ministers' memoranda. 57, consular staff at Hakodate in the north of Japan. 58, consular staff in Kobe. 59, also consular staff in Kobe. And 510, consular staff in Nagasaki. Okay, so there are 3 more volumes after this one, in which the whole thing continues. But now I can actually get round to reading what Dr. Jim Hoare has written. In fact, maybe I should read the preface first. Yes, this is my preface. The following represents, as closely as possible, what a researcher would see in the mostly handwritten files of the Satow Papers on a visit to the National Archives, formerly the Public Record Office, in Kew, West London, assuming plenty of time and other resources to make the trip. Not an easy thing to achieve at the best of times, let alone in the present pandemic. Yet these papers were left to the nation in the last will and testament of Sir Ernest Mason Satow, GCMG PC, 1843 to 1929, and he clearly hoped that his legacy would be made use of by historians after his death. This substantial book is just a small part of the available papers and contains a great deal of minutiae which may be of limited interest and trivial to those without a specific and related research topic in mind. Nevertheless, an accurate impression of the preoccupations and language of Victorian diplomacy and consular work in the late 19th century Japan may be gained by all readers. Many annotations have been added to assist the reader's comprehension. Japanese tend to know of Satow only that he was a key observer of the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, Bakumatsu, which he recorded in A Diplomat in Japan, a book based mainly on his journals, diaries of the period of 1862 to 1869. A few British people might know of this book or of his Guide to Diplomatic Practice. Neither tend to be aware of the rest of Sato's career in Japan, 1870 to 83, 1895 to 1900, China, 1862, 1900 to 1906, or elsewhere. The letters in this book are almost all addressed to Sato. The first two files are of official letters from superiors at the Foreign Office in London, including the only one Sato received from Lord Salisbury. The third file contains letters from the Office of Works about legation and consular buildings and their upkeep. The remaining files, except for the sixth, are chiefly from subordinates. The fourth is from John H. Gubbins, the Japanese secretary, and shows what kind of work he was engaged in, chiefly the monitoring of Japanese newspapers. The fifth file contains various letters from Tokyo legation staff, the sixth some of Sato's own memoranda, and the last four contain letters from consuls and consular staff at the treaty ports of Hakodate, Kobe, and Nagasaki. I wish to express my sincere thanks to Dr. J.E. Hoare, Jim Hoare, of HM Diplomatic Service, retired, and SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, for his expert foreword. He has been a great supporter of my efforts over many years, and my debt to him is indeed a great one, as I have labored to make Sato's legacy more accessible and his name better known in the world, as I believe it deserves to be. All and any errors in transcription, etc., are apologized for in advance. Also, in some cases, the letters had illegible parts, which have been so marked in the text. This is the first of 4 already published volumes of Sato's correspondence relating to his time as minister in Japan, 1895 to 1900. Ian Ruxton, Professor Emeritus, Kyushu Institute of Technology, QTech, in other words, we call it QTech, May the 9th, 2021. After that, in the book, I'll just show you, that's from the first letter in the file, first file. And then, of course, Sato himself in 1903. And then, we'll just continue. Okay, next is Dr. Jim Hoare's foreword. So the foreword. Ernest Sato first went to Japan as a student interpreter in 1862, aged 19. He was a precocious young man who had applied for the recently established post in Japan as he completed his degree at University College London. Japan and things Japanese would continue to dominate his life well after he retired, even though he moved out of what had become the Japan Consular Service after 1884 into the diplomatic service. In that role, he headed diplomatic posts in Siam, now Thailand, Uruguay, and Morocco, before returning to Japan as Minister Plenipotentiary and Envoy Extraordinary in 1895, followed by a similar post as Minister to China from 1900 to 1906. Only towards the end of his life did he begin to lose interest in what had become a country very different from that he had first known in the turbulent days of the 1860s. However, it is not just that Sato had an interesting career. He was also an assiduous retainer of paper. He seems to have kept a huge range of private and semi-private letters over the whole of his career, from age 19 until his death in 1929. Most of us keep some papers, and perhaps diplomats whose life until recently tended to revolve around papers of one kind and another are particularly prone to do so. Sato's collected papers, including his diary and much more, are therefore not unique. But Sato's collection is particularly rich, both because of the years covered and the range of contacts. Meticulously arranged, the collection was deposited in what was then the Public Record Office, now the National Archives in London, and has been available to researchers ever since. For obvious reasons, the material is particularly rich on Japan. Scholars of modern Japanese history have made extensive use of it. It throws light on the high politics of the late Bakumatsu period, the Meiji Restoration, and the development of the Meiji state. Both professionally and privately, Satow got to know many of the principal participants in those events, which makes the papers particularly valuable. They also cast light on well-known personalities involved in East Asia, such as Sir Harry Parkes, who became something of a bête noire with Satow, and scholars such as Basil Hall Chamberlain, W.G. Aston, William George Aston, and J.H. Gubbins, John Harrington Gubbins. The last two, as well as being colleagues, were close friends. Satow's diary, also among his papers, formed the basis of his memoir of the Japan of the 1860s, which was published as A Diplomat in Japan in 1921 and is still available in print. But until Professor Ian Ruxton undertook the laborious task of transcribing and publishing the rest of the material, the bulk of it was only available via a visit to the British Government Archives, first in central London and later at the new National Archives in Kew, West London. Now the material is in printed form so that, as Ruxton himself notes, the researcher at home or in a far distant library can see exactly what they would see in Kew. Given the vagaries of some of the handwriting, they also have a much easier task. The present volume begins with the correspondence with the Foreign Office and the Office of Works. They include Satow's formal appointment to the Tokyo Post in a dispatch from Lord Kimberley, Foreign Secretary, until the fall of the Liberal government that year, 1895. More interesting is a letter dated the 1st of October, 1895, from Lord Salisbury, Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary in the new Conservative government that took office the same year. Satow had written to ask for guidance on how he should approach Japan. This request must have caused some surprise in London. Envoys even as late as 1895 were still left to get on with the job. Although the telegraph allowed speedy exchanges, its use was expensive and generally avoided. Traditional correspondence was still the norm. With Satow's long experience of Japan and with Salisbury new in the job, the Foreign Secretary indicated that there was little guidance he could give. He rather thought that Japan would look to Russia and China to counterbalance British interests in East Asia, which would prove to be somewhat off-beam. But he did advise that Satow work to support British specific commercial interests, including support for individual firms, rather than following the somewhat hands-off approach adopted hitherto. The Office of Works papers show the constant tension that seemed to exist between that department and those in post. The task of Works with regard to the overseas estate, have long since passed to the current Foreign and Commonwealth Office, although financial supervision lies ultimately with the Treasury. In its day, however, Works was seen by many as arbitrary in its approach. Satow had to justify often very minor expenditure, not just on his own residence, but also the various diplomatic and consular premises in Japan. This now included Taiwan, Formosa, which Japan acquired from China in the Treaty of Shimonoseki that ended the Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 95. It must have all been very time-consuming. The real meat of this volume begins on page 51, PRO 30/3354, with the correspondence between Satow and the staff of the legation. Today, most of what is recorded in these letters would be done face-to-face. After all, the legation staff were on the same compound as the minister. But the latter would work from the residence rather than from the main office, known as Chancery, a practice that continued in some posts until the 1960s. Whereas nowadays, one would walk into the head of post's office to explain something, perhaps handing over a paper to go with the explanation, Satow seems to have received most information by letter. Clearly, one did not disturb the chief. There is also a high degree of formality in how officers addressed each other in writing. Conventions have, of course, changed. Whereas nowadays, most members of a diplomatic mission would address colleagues in this type of semi-official exchanges by their given names, in Victorian times, until the 1960s, men addressed each other by their surnames, family names. Yet, although Satow had known both Gubbins and Longford and others such as J.C. Hall as fellow student interpreters or as consular colleagues, For the most part, he remained aloof. Only one or two, such as H.S. Wilkinson and James Troup, addressed him as Sato. Nobody addressed him as Ernest, although he did write to another old acquaintance, Richard Robison, chair of the Yokohama Chamber of Commerce, on one occasion as Dear Dick. The letters from Chancery are mostly from J.H. Gubbins, then the Japanese secretary, and from his temporary replacements, such as Joseph Longford. Those covered a whole range of political and economic interests. Much correspondence related to the 1894 revised British treaty with Japan and the new treaties with other powers. Gubbins had been an important part of the British negotiating team. Perhaps understandably, he was resentful of any criticism of the terms of the new treaty. He could brush off that which came from the foreign community, but was apparently less tolerant of criticism from his colleagues. Longford, who worked with him, who in a long memorandum sent to Sato made it clear that he sided with the non-official view, asked that it not be shared with Gubbins since they had to work together. Perhaps there was wisdom in Sato's aloofness. Other areas of interest include the growing Japanese interest in Korea in the wake of the just concluded Sino-Japanese War. Later, developments in China that would eventually lead to Sato's posting there in 1900 begin to be a concern. The vast majority of the remaining letters in volume 1B of the hardcover version are from the consular ports Kobe, Nagasaki, and Hakodate, with Yokohama in volume 2. As well as being minister, Sato was also consul general for Japan and therefore was the direct supervisor of the posts. This again involved him in a lot of detail about allowances and the estate. It also meant chivying them along. Sato, understandably, placed much emphasis on the need to acquire a good command of Japanese, making it quite clear that promotion was dependent on it. He was occasionally sympathetic about the difficulties of making time for study, given the many other demands that might be pressing, but refused to contemplate any change in the rules. He clearly found some idle. John Carey Hall was constantly chased over his trade returns and other reports. Even when they could be prized out of him, they were rarely fully satisfactory first time. Longford could also be a trial. Yet Sato wrote to London arguing for extra allowances for both, since they had large families and were both poor men. All in all, the papers make fascinating and informative reading. Personalities and talents come to the fore. The strains of living in Japan, even with a good position, were considerable. Staff, including Sato himself, seemed to suffer from a variety of illnesses. Houses and offices were inadequate, and there was often a feeling of not being appreciated. It was all very different from the heady days of the 1860s. J.E. Hoare, September 2020.